I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
that I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States.
I think Trump is so identified with the Trump part of his story that it's been a little bit of a revelation to Americans to find out that, oh, wait a minute, his mother was from Scotland.
It's a great American story. It is the American story of poor immigrants arriving, working really hard, making America great, as the president says himself, and establishing themselves in the new world.
To go from there to where the Trump family ended up on the top of Trump Tower seems quite the moonshot.
When one of my friends said that one of her friends had pictures of a young Mary Trump, or Mary Anne MacLeod as she was then, I first asked, well, what's her connection to the village? It turned out none whatsoever. Her grandmother had been the teenage pen pal of Mary Anne MacLeod, and they'd exchanged letters, of course, but they'd also swapped photos of each other, which gave us this incredible insight to the life of a young Mary Trump, Mary Anne MacLeod, gave us a window into that world and gave us photos that not even the president himself might have seen.
My dad voted for Trump, and we have our disagreements there. So we went through that Christmas, so we're over that now. We just don't talk about it. But a lot of people I know in the States don't like him, of course, as well. So yeah.
We could be here all day, kind of talking about this, right? Yeah, he's a horrible creep, and
he's anti-immigrant, helping refugees. And I myself came to the United States as a refugee, so it's kind of personal for me.
So if you're just like going on about immigrants, etc., that they're terrorists, they're criminals, then of course they don't feel at home, then they don't contribute if they can do.
And we admire the work you do in trying to keep America safe and prosperous, as we say in Scotland. History back. You are a bastard if you support your and prosperous.
Karina. It was like, it's amazing what you can do nowadays. Ach, van mijn Roberts, wel, sana Lewis, hamisje, as net heren en sheer. Ach, heb ik aan de hier wakken, len staatje nu niet je. Le zei Kershaw, hamisje, as ne vale. The Mahas Donald Trump. Yes. We were supposed to fly into New York on the Monday and I was gigging on the Wednesday night. Lo and behold, the flight was cancelled, so I didn't fly in until the Tuesday. And the Tuesday when we landed in New York, Donald Trump announced that he was running for presidency. Now, it takes about 3 to 6 weeks to write a good few gags. I had a 10-minute slot. In my infinite wisdom, I decided to change my material because, you know, it's a gift. You know, who can stand up on stage in New York and say, by the way, I'm from the same village as Donald Trump's mother? And so, lo and behold, I changed the set that night, and luckily, fingers crossed, the little bit I did change worked. Could have been a disaster, but it wasn't. Så att de syr att det rasen. Det sa det Hudovic. Olé, I thought this is boy. So I'll open my gag and say, you know, I'm from the same village as Donald Trump's mother, but I said, I'm sure there's nobody else in this room that can say they've eaten a piece of cake made by the cousin of the President of the United States of America on the night of their auntie's wake, and it gave them the shits. So, I always try to get the audience to top that. Normally, nobody can.
Although it was a poor family and a poor village that she was born into, she had a slightly elevated status. Her dad was a councillor, he was a fisherman, so he was slightly wealthier than the crofters around him, and he ran the post office. He was the postmaster, which would have been a kind of a trickle of an income as well. So although it was a family of 10, they would have been slightly better off perhaps than other people. So although she was born in a black house, that stone thatched cottage that you see in these traditional photos of the Highlands and Islands, she grew up in what we call a white house, ironically enough, which was the modern Department of Agriculture, stone-built, windowed, slate-roofed house. Because her father was the postmaster as well, she had this other window on the world. Telegrams would have come and gone, news would have been broken in the post office, letters would have come from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, America, from the colonies. So it was a kind of a crossroads. Her house, or her father's house, would have been a crossroads on the world. She'd have had not just a village perspective, a kind of little parochial perspective, basically the world came to her doorstep. So she was well prepared by all these kind of factors to go abroad herself, to move to the States herself, which is what she did. Tong village, to this day, you would describe as a Gaelic-speaking village, I guess. It's only 3 miles outside the main town of Stornoway in the Hebrides, which is an English-speaking town. But the rural areas are Gaelic, and certainly were Gaelic at the beginning of the 20th century. The language of the church, the language of the home and the hearth would have been Gaelic, but the language of the school would have definitely been English. Gaelic was not promoted or even condoned within the educational sphere. In fact, people are educated out of Gaelic to improve themselves, so they thought. And in fact, her father had a role in the school. Her father was almost, you would say, the school janitor. He was what they called the whipper-in, which was a kind of a stipend somebody got to go out and collect the kids who were truanting. For example, if they were truanting digging potatoes in the autumn, or if they were truanting cutting peat or turf at the beginning of the summer, his job would have been to whip them in, get them into school. So, yeah, she'd have lived in a Gaelic-speaking world and had a window on the world through letters and news coming into the post office, and obviously an English perspective on the world through her education.
The arrival of medical care in the islands, I think it's a tremendous boon. Well, it was in so many ways, but in other ways it wasn't. Because the old, say, early Victorian times, you maybe 10 children, you raise 4 with luck. And suddenly you're having 10 children raising 10. And the question immediately came, how are you going to feed them? And when they grow up, where are they going to live? Well, as the croft is small enough, you could perhaps share it with one son. But with 10 of a family, most of them are going to have to leave.
All her brothers and sisters emigrated. There was a huge wave of emigration from the islands and from across Europe after the First World War. The island of Lewis had suffered particularly harshly in the First World War. There was a great loss of men. There was a great tragic loss of men at the end of the war, compounded with huge demand for land. It was an overpopulated island, no work, and literally no food.
I was saying to somebody recently, it sounds terrible put so baldly, but there was a shortage of eligible men. So many had been lost in the war, so many had gone off on the Marlock and the Metagavin ships, that for a young woman, the chances were stay at home if you want, find a job in Stornoway if you can, or leave. And most of them left. There was nothing else they could do.
Between 1922 and 1924, 150 people left that village. Now, they would have all walked out past Mary Anne's front door. She would have seen that migration generation, as I call them, leave. And that wasn't a unique experience to Lewis or Scotland. Italians, Irish, Germans, all left Europe to go to the New World at that time. When Mary Anne was 14 years old, she must have seen in a newspaper this competition winner in the Dundee Courier. This other young girl who was 15, Agnes, had won an art prize in the Dundee Courier. And Agnes recalls in later life how she received a letter from a young Mary Anne MacLeod writing to her from the lonely Isle of Lewis, as she put it. All her brothers and sisters had gone abroad to Canada and New Zealand and the States, and she wondered if she could be her pen pal. And they began corresponding. They began writing to each other, and that was a correspondence and a deep friendship that lasted their whole life long.
Agnes was my grandmother, and she was born in Carnoustie in Scotland, and then she grew up in Dundee in a tenement. She was an only child. She learnt the piano at a very early age. They had a piano in the flat, and she entered lots of different festivals and competitions, and won quite a lot of them. Her father would take her sort of into Broth or Edinburgh sometimes, and over to Glasgow for various festivals, and she would often win medals. But she was also academically very bright. So I think her parents persuaded her to move towards the academic rather than the musical. My first year at Dundee High was not really a happy one, in contrast to my early school years. I was one of 5 scholarship pupils, none from my part of Dundee. Most of my classmates belonged to wealthy families and had also attended the junior part of the school with high fees before coming to class 5 where I started. My mother had sewn my school uniform at home, even my coat, and I think I felt myself to be a sort of second-class pupil, which seems silly nowadays, but there was certainly a lot of snobbery at Dundee High. The very first one that she sent, in fact with the first letter, is of Mary Anne. She appears to be on a cliff top with a friend or one of her sisters picking wildflowers. It's a lovely photograph.
Agnes and Mary developed this pen-pal relationship for a couple of years, and so when Mary Anne left Lewis for the first time to head to New York, where two of her elder sisters already were, she stopped off in Glasgow, and Agnes and she met up for the first time. And as Agnes recalls in her memoir, which we've read, it seems to be a kind of an instant kind of attraction. You can tell that two young girls who just kind of loved being with each other. They just seemed to have so much fun together and were very, very close.
They were both from modest backgrounds, both ambitious to get away from that. I think my grandmother, sort of academically, she wanted to get away from Dundee and the tenements. And obviously Mary, she wanted, she had ambitions to follow her brothers and sisters.
Shows the well-known immigration station at Ellis Island, New York. During the busy period of a few years ago, more prospective citizens of this country arriving from abroad entered through this world-renowned station than through any other port of the country.
The story of the village, of course, is that Mary Anne MacLeod went to New York on holiday to see her sister. Now, very few people went on holiday from the Isle of Lewis in the 1920s. And Agnes Stiven reveals in her own memoir of her correspondence with Mary Anne that she actually went to work as a domestic. Her sister was working as a domestic servant in a house in New York. Mary Anne MacLeod, she may well have gone on holiday to New York, but was quickly found work as a domestic servant in upstate New York.
The first of the family I know of was a cousin of hers who went across to Canada first, probably, and then into the States and married there. Then, like most people who were doing all right, she came home to visit. And when she went back, she took Mary Anne's sister with her. Mary Anne's sister married there. She came back with her child to visit, and she took Mary Anne back with her. And gradually the whole family moved across stage by stage as they went.
She would have been part of a large number of people employed as domestics in the U.S. at that time. That was a very significant part of the workforce. I've seen it reported, and I'm not quite sure if it's something like a third, a very significant portion, because this was an industrialized country, but that was just nothing like it would be even a decade later. Everything got ramped up in World War II and then really took off. perhaps gave her a glimpse at just how the rich live, and a sort of grande dame appearance and presentation of Carnegie's widow. And certainly in her later years, Mary Trump had a kind of a grande dame look with her mink coat and her very elegant and ladylike presentation. It's a little early to call him a magnate, but he was a real estate developer. His father had been had established the family in Queens after having come to the U.S. from Germany, gotten together the kind of first nest egg by being a hotel manager and owner in the Northwest and the Yukon during the gold rush. That grub stake comes back to New York City and is the beginning of the Trumps in real estate. He and his mother were sort of real estate travelers, I guess you could say. He would build a house, they would live in it, they would sell it, they'd move, then he'd build another house, they'd move to that house. So they changed addresses a number of times as he would build these spec houses and then sell them as he was getting going in the course of the 1920s in Queens. He was a very, very sharp-eyed, on-the-make guy who realized bankruptcy court, foreclosed properties, that would be a really good place to be looking for areas that he could develop. And he had just gotten going in that when he meets Mary MacLeod.
My grandmother got a scholarship, a Carnegie scholarship, to go and study somewhere in Europe. She was given the option of various universities, and she chose Marburg University in Germany, and went there in 1933, which obviously was a very significant year.
she goes back out in 1934, she meets Agnes Stiven again. They meet up in Glasgow. When you read Agnes's memoir, they had a wild time. They went shopping on Sohail Street, on the big main street. Mary Anne buys fur-lined gauntlets for her boyfriend. And Agnes says, will he like them? And Mary Anne says, he better. You know, so she was quite, she was quite firm about it. They went to see the Queen Mary, the great passenger liner that was being constructed on the Clyde, in the Clyde shipyards at the time. And then she sails off. Mary Anne sails off in the SS Transylvania to New York for the last time as a MacLeod.
The legend is that they met at a party. It's certainly plausible. And she would describe him as the most eligible bachelor in New York. I think that was absolutely how she saw him. I'm not sure that this was an official title, but he was eligible, he was a bachelor, and he was a handsome guy. He supposedly went home and said to his mother, I've met the woman I'm going to marry. These kinds of sentiments are lovely to hear, and whether they happened on that night, we don't know.
There's a photo of her in upstate New York, in the Hamptons, and she's sitting by a swimming pool. Once again, it's a black and white photo, but you know that hair is platinum blonde. She looks like Hollywood. She's wearing a bathing costume. She just looks incredibly glamorous. She's completely transformed. And a final photo of her in the driveway of the new home her husband had built for her in Queens, in the up-and-coming borough of Queens in New York. And she's sitting on that driveway holding her firstborn child, also called Mary Anne. And she's made it, hasn't she? She's just gone from the old world, where she was born, into dirt poor family of 10. And here she is in the richest country in the world, in the richest city in the world, married to one of the men who's going to become the richest men in the world.
My grandmother married a fellow student who was German, obviously, and she was a German living in Germany when war broke out. So her home country was at war with her husband's, country, and must have been a very difficult predicament.
The war changed everything. Agnes was a German student, a very talented university student. She studied in Germany. She had a German fiancé. And in that window of hope, they must have thought hope, when Chamberlain and Hitler made peace in 1938, they got married and she moved to Germany. Mary Anne, of course, was on the other side of the Atlantic in America, married to a second-generation German, as it happened. They both married German men, but their fate was very different. Mary Anne's life became one of opulence and wealth in the borough of Queens in New York. Agnes's life turned out very differently.
Men of the gallant British 1st and 8th Armies are welcomed with open arms.
In these pictures of Prague's liberation, just released, German signs are torn down and smashed. But Prague's long fight is not yet won.
It was the Americans who sort of drove in and started sort of liberating the different towns. And my grandmother, being very pragmatic, leapt out of the cellar as the American troops arrived and yelling that she was Scottish, so sort of claiming her home nationality again, and offered her services as a translator. Rather an epic journey across Europe with hundreds of other, perhaps thousands of other refugees all returning home. And she returned first across the Channel to London and then took the train home to Dundee. And she writes about how the White Cliffs of Dover were very poignant, but nothing compared to crossing the Tay. That was real homecoming. Friday was a wearisome day. We were too tired to want to look at London. We had something to eat again before boarding the night express to Edinburgh at 7 p.m. We had a carriage to ourselves and the children stretched out on the seats, but none of us slept much. Edinburgh was at the end of the line. It was just after dawn and bitterly cold. The first train to Dundee was at 7 a.m. We spent 2 hours in a deserted, bleak waiting room on Waverley Station and finished off our last biscuits, bought with US dollars on the ferry. It was about 9 a.m. when the train rumbled over the Tay Bridge. The children were awestruck by the huge bridge and the glittering expanse of the river. The city and the imposing bulk of the law came into sight. I hugged the children and burst into tears. This was home at last.
His father was famous for a deal is closing, everybody's got their pens out, and his father insists on renegotiating. A guy very, very frugal, a very hard bargainer, and very hard on his children, at least within the workplace. And the older brother was not able to stand up to that and was sort of shunted aside. And Donald very early on became the most aggressive one and became the heir apparent. And that seemed, by the time he left high school, that was pretty well established.
Who would enter West Point from civilian life normally seek an appointment from their congressmen or senators. Other appointments go to enlisted men of the regular armed forces, the National Guard, and the reserves.
And will, to the best of my ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
In later life, we know for sure, she'd come home. She'd come home to see her cousins. She'd come home to the old country, often accompanied by her elder daughter, Mary Anne. She certainly didn't dress down in older age. She seemed to like her furs and her kind of fancy hair, she kind of very, very, very groomed lady. And she'd have been seen around town, dressed as if she was walking down the sidewalks of Manhattan, but actually walking down the pavements of a harbour town of Stornoway. So I guess she would have stood out, and she was known. But she came and went, and her family, had kept maintained the family connections right up to the time of her death.
You would be able to tell that Mary Anne Trump left the country. To tell you the honest truth, well, how she was to us anyway. I remember my mother and father came up one day and they had asked her up for dinner one night. Mary Anne and Anna, Mary Anne's sister and the husband. And you would never say, listening to the three of them, that Mary Anne and her sister had ever left. They didn't have, I almost said accident, They didn't even have an accent. I don't know what they might have been like when they were over there. That could have been different. But certainly when they would come home, they didn't have any accent. No. They were lovely. They were beautiful. That's the honest truth.
At that time, the Trump name wasn't so famous anyway, although many in the village did know that she had married a very wealthy man. But after that, there was no mention of Donald at the time. And with that, people didn't have much reason to take interest in the family. People would know a little about him, not much. They were left alone here.
None of them, and none of the sisters either. They never turned, never looked down on the people of Tong village ever. And that's as honest as I can be. No.
They were pleased at how she did, after she left the island and the circumstances of poverty. They were very proud that she had done well, and that she had enough of worldly things anyway, and that she kept up the relationship she had with this place, with her home. With that, she taught the family in the ways of the island, in the ways of the community, and I would hear that about them.
I'm sure they're proud. I wouldn't say they weren't. I'm proud. I'm not sure if that is because they're related to me or not. I don't know. But certainly they were a lovely couple. Mary Anne and her mother, they gave a lot of money to Tong for the hall. They gave a lot of money to Bethesda. Donald never gave a penny, no.
You know about that? Everybody knows Selena's got it.
He was wonderful and a very eligible, the most eligible bachelor in New York. So there.
The next morning, she wrote a letter to the 66th floor, Trump Towers, addressed to Mary Trump, enclosing photocopies of the photos she had received 60 years earlier to prove that she wasn't just somebody trying to con her. She sent off this letter, and that very weekend, she got a reply back from Mary Trump explaining how she'd been looking for her childhood friend all these years and had lost her. And they were reunited.
Anne and her daughter were visiting London, and she telephoned my grandmother and said, come and have lunch with us at the Dorchester. And so, of course, my gran, always one for a bit of glamour, said absolutely, and rushed down to London on the train and entered the Dorchester, and they had their poignant reunion. I think one of the nicest things about it was that my grandmother said she still sounded exactly the same. She still had the same lovely accent. And my grandmother obviously still sounded like she was from Dundee. They were still the best of friends. And it was just like they were teenagers again. And they kept in touch after that as well. I think Mary Anne sort of would send photographs of her family. She sent videos of anniversaries and birthdays and lots of glamorous parties in New York and in Florida.
To go from there to where the Trump family ended up on the top of Trump Tower seems quite the moonshot, and literally unimaginable.
It's a great American story. It is the American story of poor immigrants arriving, working really hard, making America great, as the president says himself.